What's up, summoners? Kingler here. Today, we're going to be talking about different speed tiers in RTA and even in Arena and Guild Wars to help you kind of know when you get new heroes or when you're building your heroes or when you're going against an opponent to kind of gauge what the speed of the opponent will be. So, to do that, the way the video will play out, and it will be split into the different sections, is we'll first talk about speed RNG in the game, a quick overview of what it is if you don't already know, and how that affects the speed tier. Then we'll actually look at the base speed of the characters because that actually kind of determines typically around what speed range you're going to be. And then we're going to go to a nice little graphic that I created to kind of give you an idea of the different speed tiers, what you can expect of these different speed tiers, and get a better idea that way. But if you like the video, make sure you like, subscribe, and Discord server, link down in the description. But without further ado, let's get right into it. So let's kind of first start talking about what is speed RNG. So something that a lot of people don't know, but if you've seen the combat readiness at the start of a match and you're getting that combat readiness for your characters, there is a 5% difference that you can get at 5% more or 0%, right? So it's a 0 to 5%. This comment kind of explains it pretty well because they've talked about it at the CRNG, and the speed RNG only plays for taking turn 1, right? So that's the only time you'll actually have to worry about it. And typically what that means is if you have a 200 speed unit, right? At the start of the battle, you may have an extra 10 speed because it's 5% of that 200 speed, or you don't get that extra speed, right? So if your opponent also has a 200 speed unit and you both have a 200 speed unit and you get 0% boost, that extra RNG, you're essentially going to be at 200, and then your opponent will have that extra 10 speed, so it'll be quote unquote a 210 speed unit. And vice versa, if you had a 209 speed unit and your opponent had a 200 speed unit and you get a 0% boost, and the opponent got the full 5% for his 200 speed unit, the 200 speed unit would actually outspeed you, right? And this is going to get even higher and higher as your speed gets higher, because since it's percentage based, if you're at 300 speed, that's going to be more than 10 speed. It's going to be like 12 or 13 speed, which is going to be a lot of speed RNG. So it is important to note that you can't actually skip between the speed tiers depending on that speed RNG. And it's important to note how people can get outsped in RTA, even if your unit is 290. And your opponent may have a 300 speed unit. If you get good speed RNG, you might actually be able to outspeed them. And why you sometimes can't do combos just as perfectly where your units always go right before one another. So that kind of gives you a quick introduction into that. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but that is going to take us now into the base speed of heroes, right? And this is kind of important to note, because a lot of the times the base speed of a hero will determine kind of what speed bracket they're going to be. And typically Smaga does a good job at giving the characters the right amount of speed. But 129 is going to be the fastest base speed with Ran, which means that without any gear, you already have an advantage over the next fastest hero of 1 speed, which can make a pretty big difference when you're talking about cleaving an opponent and your opponent is trying to outspeed you, right? So and you kind of can see through, right? So you see anti-cleave Acid, pretty popular one, 128 speed, or even things like Sid at 126 speed, right? Who's also pretty common anti-cleave hero right now, and a cleave hero, because Sid is kind of amazing right now. But you can see it's at 126, 2 speed lower than Ran, or 3 speed lower than Ran, which at the end of the day, that is going to make a pretty big difference. But if there's no Ran on the table, you're looking at one of the fastest heroes in the game, right? And he's going to easily outspeed a lot of different brackets, with Conquer Lilius, another common speed threat, being all the way down to 121, being a whole 8 speed slower. That is a huge difference when you're looking at just the base speed, because assuming you have the same gear as your opponent, they're more likely to go take turn 1, although of course there's still that potential speed RNG difference, right? So that kind of is going to lead us into the different speed brackets. So here I have them all kind of organized for you guys, so you can kind of see what we're going to be talking about. But basically, the range all the way from base speed, which is very, very slow, 100 to 130/140. Very, very slow. You're not really looking for speed. You may get a couple of substats here and there, or the base speed of some heroes are faster. And you go all the way up to anti-cleave and fast cleave, where you're talking about 300 plus speed units we're going to be seeing. It's important to know that these brackets are going to be more for Challenger and Low Emperor, because that's usually the range that I operate at. In High Emperor and Legend, this gets turned on its head, where there are Bruisers that are incredibly tanky, somehow still going to be at like mid-range speeds. And there's going to be speed threads like Conquer Lilius that are going to be 320 speed plus or 310 speed plus, right? Speed gets crazy higher up. It's just ridiculous how fast people can make their units. And there also is a lot of techs because people will take units like Kise and then bumping them up all the way to 320, right? But kind of starting off to talk about each one to get an idea of what the heroes are. First, at base speed, Typically, these are going to be heroes that really don't need speed to go. These are going to be heroes that either get to counterattack through focus or through some passive. An example of this would be Seaside Bellona or the new Summer Charlotte, right? Or even Armin, the counter hero for, again, some cleaves that, you know, she can counterattack with either Elra's Sword or her own passive. It's very easy for her to actually do damage and take turns, and she doesn't necessarily actually have to take turns through combat readiness. She can just get it through counterattacking, right? And typically you will make this hero's base speed. You don't need to actually give them any speed gear. You can just bulk up their damage and some of the other stats so you can actually do their job properly and have other support heroes help them actually do their damage. On the other hand, you have the slow counter bruisers from 140 to 180. This is going to be heroes that, you know, are a little bit on the slower side. They are typically going to be heroes that are going to have counter set attached to them because, again, with counter set, if you're trying to get very fast speed with a counter set, it is going to be hard. Some people can do it, and a lot of high Emperor players will have counter gear heroes with over 180, over 200 speed. That is going to actually be a thing. But for the most part, most of your counter heroes will float around this 150, 180 range. Heroes like Violet can also be in this range. Meru Chu is typically in this range. Little Queen Charlotte, right? They don't need too much speed, right? They have ways to counterattack, either with the gear but they still need to be able to take some turns, right? Like Arc Seaman's Shadow, you still want her to be taking turns. You want her to get to her S3. You are going to be using support heroes like Ross and Emilia to get her to take the turn, but it's not as critical that she takes the turns naturally, right? Although, yes, you do need a little bit of speed, right? So it's going to be the slower bruiser counter heroes. Then you're going to be going to the bruiser / heavy DPS. This is where almost all your bruisers are going to be. And if you didn't know what bruiser is, it's usually a high HP hero that can deal a pretty good amount of damage and sustain throughout the fight. In case for the people that don't know that. And you're also going to be seeing a lot of your heavy DPS heroes in this range, right? Some examples: Apocalypse Ravi, very, very common to see her around 200 speed. That is where most A Ravis are. There are some that will go up to 240, but 200 is pretty standard for a Ravi. Things like Fawn Cecilia, you know, your very bulky heroes like Fawn Cecilia and supports are going to be here. Some of your slower supports like AOL. Things like Alencia are going to be around this range, typically with the injury set. Lionheart Sermia, where she still needs to be taking those turns, she still needs to be damaged. And then for your heavy DPS heroes, things like Spectre Tenebria, where they can do very heavy damage and they need to have really good gear to be able to do heavy damage, but are not necessarily going to be that fast because you're using your gear to actually go into a more offensive build. So that's going to move us into kind of the mid-range, which is going to be the highest place where speed RNG will happen, because there are heroes all the way from 220 to 250 that it's pretty crazy how usually this is where most bruiser players will play and where most bulkier heroes will be around, right? A lot of players play here. I'm typically a mid-range player. I like to be 220, 250 speed. Some of my heroes are going to be a little bit faster, but the majority are going to be around that 220 speed. And typically this is where you're going to be things like Mediator. For some higher up people, this is going to be 260, right? Mediator can actually get pretty fast. Same thing with Ross, but typically they're on the upper range of that mid-range. And then you have things like bulkier Emilias, right? My Emilia is a little bit bulkier but slow. Bulky AOLs that aren't trying to take turn one, but are going to be surviving with high ER. Things like Sage Ball that are able to get that 20% CR push. Polides, Hua, who's a very heavy DPS hero that wants to take turns, and can be pretty fast, but doesn't necessarily have to be 270 speed. Again, there are different techs, but typically you're starting to get limited here by that base speed, right? A lot of the heroes here, the reason they're not higher is going to be because of their base speed, right? Even things like Mediator, Cowrick, and Hua, they have around 100, 109 speed. When you compare it to things like Ran and Sid and all the other, and even Cowrick and Kisa in the upper next tier, that's typically going to be the main restrictor, is going to be that base speed, where you're going to need really good gear to be able to get that speed, and you're losing a lot of other stats that you otherwise wouldn't get, right? So it's important to note that, again, this is going to be a very big speed range, so you can't expect to outspeed some of the higher heroes. But again, you may be 260, 265, 262 speed with speed RNG around this range. But that's going to take us, now we're starting to look at a little bit of faster speed DPS, slower setup supports, quote unquote slower, although they're still pretty fast in the grand scheme of things. But these are the heroes that are trying to get you turn one, right? These are the heroes that you were trying to set up early. You're trying to take turn one away from your opponent, from another bruiser player, right? You're not going to be outspeeding a cleaver, right? This range is still not even close to cleave range. This range is still bruiser level place. And typically these heroes will be very late picked in the rotation, mainly because they're going to be to counter the slower players, to try to take away advantage by taking turn 1, by setting up your team. You will have units like Kisei, Cowrick here that are going to be pretty fast, 280. Some Kiseis, again, are going to be faster. Speed Landy does float around this range where she can set up against a Bruiser team early, and she can push up her own team forward and do a lot of damage, and the opponent may not expect that Landy to be all the way up to 280, right? And can still do damage, right? Or even things like Solitaria and even some Sid, although some Sids people do build him for anti-cleaving, as we saw with that base speed. Because of his high base speed, and because he gives a speed imprint, a lot of people do take him as an anti-cleave hero. But just as a note, for the most part, for damage Sids, they're going to be floating around this range where, you know, they're trying to take that turn 1, they're trying to act early, but they're not necessarily going to be outspeeding some cleavers. Although, again, as we mentioned, for anti-cleave and speed setups, they will. And then lastly, you're starting to get to the speed threats, slower cleave setups. This is the ones that you're guaranteeing yourself to try to get turn 1. You're really trying to press the opponent, right? You're thinking about cleaving the opponent. You're going to be aggroing the opponent. You need to have at least 1 or 2 of these heroes if you're trying to aggro / cleave, or even one faster. Things like Conquer Lilias is going to be the most popular speed threat for Bruisers, because she does so much for Bruisers and can also pivot into more aggressive drafting. Pavel is often going to be around the 300, pushing that 300 speed range, where he really pressures the opponent to have to pick an anti-cleave option, or you will take that turn 1 and be able to do a lot of damage. Light Dominiel, often again around this 300 speed. Other ones being Emilia and Diane, they typically do float this fast because they're able to either push the team up or set up some crazy good buffs early on, making it hard for the opponent to actually do anything. And even things like Flan, right? So it's going to be the only reason these heroes are not higher up is going to be because of their base speed. Again, that's going to be the primary reason they can't often be faster. Because when we looked at something like Ran is going to be 229 speed, right? The closest thing that can kind of speed contest them is going to be a Sid, which is only 1 speed slower, right? And then you're looking at Conquer Lilias being a whole 8 speed slower. If you pick Conquer Lilias, a cleave can easily outspeed you, especially when they start putting things like speed imprints, right? But typically at this anti-cleave range, you're going to be seeing the Rans, you're going to see the Payras, the A-Sids, the regular Sids, right? If they're actually trying to outspeed you. And typically it is something that's where a lot of cleavers are going to be operating at. 300 plus. You're starting to see some crazy levels of RNG here. A speed threat like a Conquer Lilias can actually outspeed all the way up to a Ran. Assuming you had the exact same speed gear and the Ran was a whole 8 speed faster than you, speed RNG at this level is a whole 12, 13 speed. So your 300 speed Lilias can outspeed your opponent's 310 speed Ran, right? Which is crazy to think about, but it's one of the reasons why the cleaver often will still have to pick some speed imprints to make sure that they don't get outsped. But that's going to be kind of that quick introduction into the different speed brackets. It's important that you start to learn about them and really take into consideration what they are, because they really do come into play when you're actually playing RTA. So if I, for example, showed you a couple of my matches, and you kind of see, right? So this player, I know his Light Dominiel is going to be very fast, but I also have my Conquer Lilias. I have the option here of either banning the Light Dominiel or the Alencia. If I ban the Light Dominiel, if I was confident in my Conquer Lilias taking turn 1, I could have banned the Light Dominiel and I would have had turn 1 advantage, right? And I could have pushed back the Rimuru. That's an option I could have done. Of course, I saw he didn't have any DPSs, which is why I did that. But again, it's important to know, yeah, for the most part, we're playing at around 220 speed, right? With some speed threads. When we look at here, again, you see here, I started kind of bulky, and he starts pressuring my picks by picking much, much faster heroes, and actually trying to pressure my draft and aggro me, and you're going to be seeing those 250 plus type heroes coming into play. Again, here you have a much lower draft. He has that speed threat, and he's able to kind of, with the AOL and the mediator, it's like barely right there, where it's slightly slower at like 220, right? It's an ER one, and but he's still able to take that turn 1 advantage with the Conquer Lilias, still able to set up his team, right? So it's one of those things that you need to keep in mind when you're actually playing against different opponents. Again, here you can see it's a straight up cleave, but he didn't commit to the cleave, right? And I went full anti-cleave, and he wasn't able to push through. And again, yeah, even things like this, because of that speed threat of the Conquer Lilias, it made it a little bit harder for me to actually be able to outspeed, because I do see the Conquer Lilias and the Emilia. I know he's taking turn 1 away from me. I'm trying to do a non-turn 1 team, and often you do need those kind of options. But you should see what range you're operating, what heroes you need to be banning, and whether or not you want to try to contest some of these heroes if you have the gear or not. But that's going to be all I have for you guys today. I hope you'll enjoy, and I will see you next time. Peace.